out there to the Arraya Solutions Vodcast. Just like in previous podcasts, we've assembled a group of leading experts in their field to discuss various industry-relevant topics. And for the first time, we are welcoming one of our OEM partners, Cohesity. As a reminder, I am Chuck Kiesling. I am the Senior Director of Infrastructure Pre-Sales at Arraya Solutions. And today, our panel consists of Jon Hildebrand and Chris Colotti, both field CTOs with Cohesity. And on the Arraya side, I am welcoming back both Ron Longley, the director of our data center solutions, and Kirk Freeman, a senior solutions architect on Ron's team. Thanks for joining, everybody. I'm looking forward to today's chat.
Sounds like the dog's looking forward to it too.
Yeah, apparently.
It's always great though. Actually, I think it's kind of cool that we're all kind of stuck at home, so we get that kind of background noise. I actually think it's great when we do these now.
It's the occasional, but it seems like it never fails. It's there we go. She's been quiet for a long time and good right now. All right. So just to kind of throw this one up and make sure everybody's clear, Chris and Jon, why don't you take a minute to tell us a bit about your day? What is a field CTO? What do you do? What are your focuses?
Well, the running gag is that a field CTO actually isn't chief technology officer. It's more chief talking officer, because, I mean, at the end of the day, we do spend a lot of time talking with, whether it's partners, talking with customers, talking with potential customers. So we're always discussing something related to what our product set brings to the table.
Yeah, and I'll kind of add to that. It varies from company to company. If you ask folks at Pure or VMware what their field CTOs do, they're all a little bit different. The way I've always viewed it is we cover a little bit of marketing, we cover a little bit of sales. Like if you asked us a day in the life of our workflow, as an example, this morning Jon and I were on a 7 a.m. call with a customer doing an executive briefing, sort of an executive briefing for a UK customer, and then we're doing events like this with you guys. We also spent and will continue to spend coming later this year a lot of time working on trade show stuff. Like we manage the physical technology infrastructure that runs Cohesity's trade show booths. We're in the middle of trying to figure out, we've had gear in storage now for a year, so I've got Mac Minis laying everywhere in my house trying to actually patch them and figure that out. But it's a lot. Like we kind of do whatever somebody asks us to do, whether it's on the marketing side, doing videos for product demos or launches, or doing the podcast, or doing stuff like this. It all rolls up under that weird field CTO title, because to Jon's point, we do a lot of talking, but we also are presenting product. We're also presenting solutions. And in our role, we also run an environment called Customer Zero, where we're actually vetting out new releases and finding issues in the product and pushing stuff back into engineering. So we do a lot of work directly with engineering as well.
All right, so basically, chief take everything off of my plate officer. Got it.
That could be the T, actually. Yeah, I suppose so.
Well, I mean, let's kind of start with what I think is probably a little bit of an easy question, right? And more or less the intro to get us started. Cohesity kind of plays in really like a diverse and competitive space. So, I mean, how do you feel like you compete, right? Your go-to-market, your added value, the overall differentiator for Cohesity.
Jon, or me? You go ahead.
Well, yes, you are correct. We do have a platform that kind of goes across plenty of data center technologies, and that was relatively intentional. The whole idea was that Mohit originally identified that there was potential for consolidation within the data center. You think back to VMware originally when they came out, and consolidation of physical hardware down to virtual planes to try to remove as much of that physical footprint that a data center needed. We identified that there was a lot of these lower tier workloads that are in the data center that are taking up huge amounts of, whether it's capital, huge amounts of space, power, cooling. And the whole idea was to basically bring those down to something that could then be visible while on that particular platform. Because, I mean, you guys have ran data centers beforehand. You know that there's storage arrays there, but I'm pretty sure, ask anybody, you barely even know what's sitting on that storage array. So the concept was to try to take care of some inefficiencies, shed some light on some dark data, and just try to overall have a better grasp of what's going on within that particular data center. So ultimately, that's where we fit in as far as the market is concerned. And yes, that overlaps with things like NAS, it overlaps with data protection. But at the end of the day, with technology upshifting levels, this is where the idea of data management comes into play, because all of those are factors in figuring out how to manage the data that an organization is generating, because all of that is bits that's being written to disk and is useful in some capacity for an organization.
And I'll actually add a little bit. When you look at back when Cohesity, even when I started, there's this whole concept of secondary storage and the inverted pyramid, inverted iceberg, and all that other stuff. And it's been an evolution. So part of it isn't, where we play in the market, where we played in the market before, and now it's a little bit different where we're playing in the market. And it to John's point, it truly is evolved into that data management, mass data fragmentation, all that stuff that we've kind of coined the terms for. And it's actually kind of interesting because it's harder for people to understand. We get it all the time. Like, all right, what do you do? Do you do backup? Or do you do NAS? Or do you do, what is it that you guys do? And it's like, well, depends. I hate to use the old VMware answer, but it really does. I mean, if somebody's use case is still backup, that's their use case. I mean, that's where we're going to fit, and that's where we're going to play, and that's probably where we're going to do very well. If their use case is NAS and smart files, we'll start there. It's just been the long-term vision for Mohit. It's never been a one-trick pony.
Yeah, and I'll go back one step further. I mean, when you start working with analysts, and you even have a hard time trying to define, like say like Gartner and MQ with the Magic Quadrant. Well, you could simultaneously exist in multiple different Magic Quadrants with the same piece of equipment at that particular
same
point.
software platform right now is could show up in two different quadrants for object storage or backup.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. It's been my experience in working with the Cohesity team, and it's been a terrific experience, positioning products and solutions with our customers, hand in hand with you guys. Over, a couple of years, just from an observation point of view, when the conversations initially started, it was more of, let's talk to you about secondary storage. I might not care about, backup, right? You might be using Veeam, you might be using something else. Use our platform, and then maybe consider backup later. And it seems like that conversation or that talk track has flipped over the last couple of years, from my point of view, right? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that was a use case where we called it target storage, right? Where when we first came out, we were acting, and strangely enough, and I've got a lot of friends that work at Veeam, so we'll put that right out there, right? And we still talk to each other on direct message, at least every couple of days. Anthony Spiteri is a good friend of mine, and so is Michael Cade, and it's. I always told them, even flat out, I said, it always seems strange that we have customers buying Cohesity to, be target storage for you guys when we also have the backup component in it and they're just not using it. Like, that always had me scratching my head. And I think that's why it's flipped a little bit, because I think people have started to figure out that it's already there. Like that whole backup and recovery functionality is already in the product. It's, known as Data Protect, but it's there. And now you're right. It has flipped. We're seeing more customers, start out with data protection and then actually adding in the smart files piece, which has kind of gotten expanded as far as performance and capacity and all those other things, which is great. I mean, it's where we really do excel from my perspective, especially in the recovery part. All of us have been in this business a long time. I don't care how much you're doing the backup. It's the recovery that matters, right? Can you actually get back online? And I truly believe in working here that we really do that part very, very well.
I'm curious, how has, the cloud really forced a change in the way that you all operate? I mean, you've got the various cloud providers that are like, oh yeah, you can back up to us. So and I'll even be a little more specific with that question. Microsoft 365 is an example. That's a big one that we get on a regular basis. Do I need to back this up? So
I've just had this conversation 4 times in the last 2 days. I'll let John take it, but because I actually talked at nauseam at it on the last call. So.
Yeah. So one of the things you have to take a look at, especially with software as a service, is the specifics over what is and isn't being done in your contract. So they always say the devil's in the details. And when it comes to those sorts of things, they are correct. Microsoft will only do a certain amount of work up to a short time period, that if you go back and look at defined SLAs for your organization, it may not be good enough. 30 days to keep something in a recycle bin before being deleted may not be good enough when you're being told I have to keep things for up to 365 days at a minimum. Also, most of the numbers that these SaaS providers will throw at you are more oriented around availability of the service, not necessarily availability of the data that you've generated within the service. So it's one thing to take a look at and see what your needs might be, but if your business alignments are more than what those SaaS providers can provide you, you have to start looking at other solutions that are out there, or else you're going to end up basically losing data at a particular point when you know you might need it the most.
Yeah, and I'll actually bring up what I brought up last night, which is there are still people, none of the people on this call, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, that believe just because I put my data in the cloud, it's now backed up. And, that's not always true. Maybe it is a copy of the data that's out there, but just because you moved your application to, EC2 doesn't mean that application is being backed up as an EC2 instance, right? So it has changed the game. And I think even more so, we saw that, I'll touch on the AWS side as well. We saw that personally at Cohesity much more last year with the partnership and the investment from Amazon into Cohesity, right? That was a huge stepping stone for us, not only for the as a service product that we were building, but how tightly coupled that relationship is, because they're now listed as an investor in the company, but they're also assisting with a lot of the engineering that's going on because we're trying to work with their products. It's not just a standard, hey, here's the APIs, go have fun. So there is some deep rooted change that's happening. I think it's a good thing, because it's not just moving data in and out of the cloud. It's actually doing more with it, as opposed to I just stuck it out there.
Yeah, and I'd also add as well that for a lot of folks, sometimes, especially in the data protection space, or at least like long-term retention, if you're just now experimenting with the cloud, that's a good place to start to figure those things out and to get more comfortable with it. So we're seeing a lot of folks use it as, I like to call it, a toe dip into the pool, so to speak, to be able to start understanding the concepts behind the cloud. But like as mentioned beforehand, the devil is in the details. You have to read those contract line items and make sure that you're being covered where you absolutely need to be. And these days and age, they tell you data is valuable, regardless of what little bit you might think it is. It could potentially be valuable down the road in some capacity. So make sure to keep that under your particular control and wraps, and know that it's out there by utilizing some sort of product like ours to be able to keep that lit up and visible to your organization.
So, it sounds like for us, right, the answer that we are giving customers when they ask things like, well, that depends, is actually somewhat of that actually, believe it or not, a clear answer, because it requires additional information, and it's not a straight one-to-one answer. It's not do you yes, do you no, it's do you, well, it depends on what your requirements are for your data. Does that sound like an accurate statement?
Yeah, I mean, John will say this about me, like, I don't do anything without a list of requirements. And it's funny how, as ex-architects, both John and I, and still doing some architecture work, people forget that you can't really do anything without giving me the requirements. And yes or no answers aren't a requirement, right? I mean, in some cases it might be, but it really does come down to, not do you need to back up the data, but how long do you need to keep it for? Do you have to have multiple copies of it? Do you have to replicate it to other sites? If you're a financial institution, we all know that they need, they have to keep 7 years worth of data in the US. So every single industry, and forget healthcare, John's done a lot of work with healthcare as well. So, they've got different requirements. They've got different policies they have to follow.
So there was something that you had mentioned a few minutes ago, and I'm going to kind of circle it around and ask this question as intelligently as I can really position it. You know, Backup and recovery in the traditional sense, right, hasn't really been one of those, those sexy topics, right? It's usually I need to build this. Oh yeah, I need to back up and manage my data as well as the rest of these other things. But the way that you were talking about it a few minutes ago, it sounds like that conversation is actually starting to change a bit. And I know in our experience from a cloud perspective, backup and recovery is that easy dipping your toe into the cloud. So
Yep.
I want to pull on that thread a little bit if you're okay with that.
No, I'm actually fine with that. I'll give my opinion and I'll throw it over to John. I actually think the backup and recovery part still in the fact that we need to do it, you're right, isn't sexy. What has become more interesting about it is the need for it to be faster and more reliable with all of the things that are going on in the current landscape of the world, right? So where this is an example I used earlier today, you know, when all of us were young men and we were, you know, in our data centers and we were coming up in the world, we were backing up servers, but we never think back to the last time you actually restored a single physical machine because you had to go to tape, right? We were backing up because it was a necessity, but we never had to go recover an entire data center en masse, you know, 20 years ago. Unless it was we were doing a site recovery or a DR plan or something like that. But if a compact server died, and yes, I'm dating myself because I use compact, but you know, we'd go bring the tape back from Iron Mountain, right? Yeah, everybody's waving their hand, but we didn't do it at the scale of the hundreds of virtual machines or infrastructure we have to do today. So I actually think it has become, sexy is probably the wrong word, but to me it's become more interesting because when we can show customers just how fast we can recover, you know, 60, 100, 1,000 VMs in a vSphere environment, for example, and bring them back online instantly, it's like their eyes light up because that's important to them now. That really is impactful. So it has a little bit come full circle. But John, what's your take on it?
Well, it's very similar because we've gotten to the point. I mean, before I came to Cohesity, and you know, you mentioned as a younger man with maybe a little more hair on top of my head, you know, I worked in an environment that had upwards of 90,000 virtual machines. So we are talking about an environment that, you know, especially these days where your data center is constantly being bombarded and under attack, where the blast radius, should something happen, is going to be a lot larger. So instead of just the concept of an insurance policy, we now have to worry about a almost community level of recovery instead of just an individual onesie twosie with a machine here or there when something essentially outbreaks within the data center, whether it's ransomware or malware or something else that could potentially start to bring things down. So it may not be a sexy topic as mentioned, but I think now the conversations evolve much more than just an insurance policy.
Absolutely.
Against this. Now we have to worry about things like, how long is it going to take me to recover? How long can the business withstand something of this particular nature? And evolving the conversation, just kind of like how I mentioned, uplifting to a concept of data management over just, you know, data protection at that particular point. The conversation's uplifted now a little more to this concept of maybe a little more BCDR type of more business continuity, things now that can have a direct impact to a business's lifeline. You have to worry about, instead of just server A is down. Let's see what the impact is.
Yeah, it's like anything else. History repeats itself, right? And I hate to, you know, kind of go back to, you know, 2011, but when we had the events, and you think of major events in the world, right? When we had the events of 9/11, that really opened everybody's eyes to DR strategy, right? I mean, every one of us on this call were impacted in some way, either directly or indirectly, because every organization went, holy crap, that could happen to us. And what do we do? And then it kind of tailed off, right? And it's like everybody gets complacent and comfortable, and then all of a sudden ransomware attacks go through the roof, right? And we're back in that same stage. So to me, it's very cyclical. So there was a lull there, you know, Chuck, I think, where it was a second thought, and that's what people did. And now it's come back to the forefront.
And it's kind of funny that you would actually bring that up the way that you did, because that touches on really one of the next topics that I was going to kind of go into.
We didn't even try to script it.
Right. It seriously feels like you were on my planning.
It's the barber. We all go to the same barber, so
exactly. I have to stop telling him things. No, I think, I wanted to kind of drive a little bit into that, the ransomware, and the recovery from things like that, because, with our cybersecurity practice, we have conversations with a lot of customers that have experienced a ransomware event or something along those lines. So I guess, what advice, what conversations would you be having with a customer that maybe experienced something that now, I guess, because they weren't properly prepared, has to go through an entire
Yeah. I actually start out in most of those roundtable conversations, and most people who know me know the New England still lives in the boy. You can take the boy out of New England, but you can't take the New England out of the boy, right? And even though I live in Tennessee now, I look them square in the eye and I'm like, it's not a matter of if you get hit, it's just a matter of when. And if you wrap your head around that now and start planning for it, like I don't care what the event is, and it's look, ransomware. Everybody's talking ransomware, but at the end of the day, it could be any event. It could be a human error event where they just, accidentally go in and wipe a whole bunch of stuff out. Anything's possible, but it really shifts the conversation to I don't care what the event is. It's XYZ happened, and all of these things either got locked down or encrypted or whatnot. But you have to bring them back. You have to bring the whole environment back to life. And back to my earlier point, you're not bringing back one machine back to life. You're bringing your entire infrastructure back to life. We've got examples where customers, same with you guys. 400 servers go encrypted overnight, or 1,000 servers get encrypted overnight, and they've literally walked into the proverbial what show the next morning, and with no preparation. And I actually have started, Chuck, having conversations with customers around: Are you doing tabletops? Are you doing attack simulations where at least you're actually taking your IT staff and out of the blue, with no warning, bringing them into a room and saying, okay, we just got attacked. Here's the infected systems. Here's what's happened. How are you going to go about fixing it? And really get them to think on their feet, because how many of us could do that? It's a pressure situation and we don't know until we get there, and you can't train for it unless you actually try to, if that makes sense. You don't go out and run a marathon, hopefully. You train for the marathon, and then you figure out where your strong points are. Maybe you're a climber, maybe you're good at running downhill like me. But but it's a whole different conversation now, and recovery is just going to be a part of that. Like I think there's a whole bigger operational type of conversation. And to date, I've only run into probably 2 customers in conversations that are doing tabletops or surprise kind of mocks, if you will. And maybe it's because I've been watching all these space shows on TV, like, For All Mankind. But the whole NASA scenario comes back into my head, like what was it, Apollo 11, or 13, all the stuff on the table, and we've got so many amps we can work with and go figure it out, right?
Yeah, well, and I'll double with the fact that it's the reason it's an old adage, but an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of the cure at that particular point. So if you're able to table some of these things up front to begin with good effective strategies, or with good practice, because there's another adage, practice makes perfect, at the same time, that you're able to ensure a level of reliability that the business will be able to withstand. And if you can prove that to the business, they're going to feel much better prepared in the event of when this happens. Because as Chris mentioned, it's not if, it's never if, it's when. And we all know the amount of hundreds of millions of dollars in expensive hardware. I've always joked that for a security event to happen, you know how easy it is to circumvent a couple $1 million firewall? All you need is a man inside attack to find the one Post-it note that somebody posted, and now you've just defeated $2 million worth of equipment.
Or people who change their root passwords to password.
Right. That never happens. What do you mean?
No, never.
Let me drag you in a little bit, Kirk.
Yeah, no, really interesting to think about that scenario, right? You're restoring mass VMs. One thing that I really like about the Cohesity platform also is API driven. So, I guess, could you guys talk about the automation capabilities, whether it comes to deployment or mass restore, things like that? Could you guys talk maybe a little bit about what Cohesity is doing there?
Yeah. So, Chris, sit down for this one because I know you're not an automation person.
Wheelhouse.
So yeah, so
Colotti doesn't code.
Yeah, now we're in my house. So let's discuss this portion here. So everything that you see, especially if you walk through the user interface, is API driven. So anything that can happen through the user interface, and in some cases, some things that aren't in the user interface can be done through the documented APIs that we have. So if you wanted to initiate that mass restore, you could potentially script this beforehand and have it ready to go with your favorite different languages that are out there, whether it's PowerShell, Python. If for some reason you're a sadist and you like to do things through some of the API driven applications that are out there that just do straight API calls on your particular behalf, you can do those too. And as mentioned, there are other ways to also deploy things that we have. We've got things like Terraform modules. There's Ansible capabilities to be able to use so that you can standardize the deployments of these particular pieces of equipment. So everything that we have and everything that we do can be done through an API utilizing some of the more popular means and methods to be able to wield those particular APIs. So the good news is we've listened, we made sure it was there at the core, and everything that we do is based off of it so that in any scenario, if you needed to contact it, you could through some other means than just the user interface.
And I'll speak from, my non developer background, but what we've actually even done in our own environment is we've started leveraging, VRA. There's things that customers are doing through PowerShell. I mean, the means to the end doesn't matter, but it's all, what do you want it to do? I'll give you a lightweight scenario, like a service provider, right? So if a service provider wants to actually have customers spin up virtual machines and apply a policy to every one of those, they can automate the application of the policy, right? Because they can either say, hey, this tenant's VMs always, as they spin up, just attach them to this backup group, right? And that starts to make it easy for a service provider, for example, to just say, hey, all your VMs are getting backed up once a day. It's just part of the service. And that may be up to them. But they don't have to go in and find all the VMs that were added by that tenant at the end of the day and, add them. They can do it on an automated fashion. So to John's point, it's always been there. It's just, you'd be surprised how many people don't leverage, automation still at this point.
So I'm curious. Is that automation capability spread across things like the on-prem cloud edition? Then
it's the same on all of them. Yeah, it's the same API set because it's the same software.
Yeah. Now, slightly different clusters. If you're accessing direct clusters, the API is going to be slightly different than if you're going to do things through Helios, but that's just because of a different endpoint. But for all intents and purposes, the same APIs will be available with the feature parity that happens between on-prem and Helios.
All right. So, Ron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, great conversation so far, right? We've lived and breathed and worked in the traditional data center space, right? And that's becoming less and less traditional, right? Customers' workloads are frequently moving from, private to hybrid to SaaS. There's still maybe some lift and shift for 3-tier architectures, and then there's that, application modernization, moving to cloud native, platform as a service, containers and the like.
I think Ron just hit every buzzword he could possibly hit in like one sentence. I'm seriously impressed. Like the only one he literally left out was digital transformation. I was like, you missed it.
Nope, I'm done with that. Right. No, but there is a point, and I promise I'll stop. But it's really a now that I set that premise, right, and I think we probably all agree, it's kind of a twofold question, right? How are backup and recovery technologies adapting to that? Obviously from a Cohesity point of view, we'd love to hear your opinion. And the second part of that too is, within your portfolio, Cohesity on-prem with Data Protect, the cloud edition, DMAS, the data management as a service, right? How would you differentiate across those three and what to position where?
Yeah. You want to take the first half, John? I'll take the second.
Yeah. I'll take the first half. So when we get into things like platform as a service and application modernization, We've already started working on, and we've actually changed it with the most recent release, at least specifically with Kubernetes. So we are working in the Kubernetes space to be able to back up some things from the technical layers within. Think like namespace layer, where you can then start to gather the container, the app containers, the configuration, where you try to get more of the application state instead of just the app pieces. So if that app had some sort of persistent storage associated with it, that's going to be backed up, as well as all the application states as well, with that in one fell swoop, which then you can use and move around to either you can deploy again as another specific namespace on that existing Kubernetes cluster, or move it to another Kubernetes cluster. And as long as some of the storage capabilities matches up, you will be able to restore that particular data over there. Now, for platforms, we're in the process of adding things like VMware Tanzu and Red Hat OpenShift. So the realization is there's more to, say, app modernization than just the Kubernetes layer. There's also other things that extend above that that help with the application deployment process and the application validation process. So to be able to help those shops to be able to back up not just the endpoint where an application's in production, but along the entire journey of what that app takes to get to that particular stage, utilizing some of those particular platforms that are out there.
Yeah, and as far as how we position it, I'll tack on a little bit to what Jon said, and that's why we really have shifted to that data management part of the part of our conversation, because we don't care where the sources are, right? At the end of the day, there's so much we can do with all that data once it's ingested. I don't care where it's been ingested from, whether it's been ingested from Microsoft 365, or it's been brought in from a bunch of virtual machines, or it's been brought in from some Cohesity views running NAS. At the end of the day, we now have potentially even multiple copies of that. If there's something let's just say there's, PDF files that were sent around in an email, and that's all now being brought into the system, we're going to dedupe and deal with that, right? Because it's in everybody's mailbox. That same set of PDFs could also be sitting on a file share that we know about. So it starts to broaden it as far as how we're actually handling and managing all the data. From a positioning perspective, it's all about choice. So we don't really dictate, hey, you should run an on-prem version, on Cisco hardware versus, the cloud edition running in AWS. We've specifically built it so that, going back to, 15, 20 minutes ago when we were talking, it's all about what's the requirements. If you've got a bunch of EC2 instances, or you've got a giant M365 environment, do you actually want to run your Cohesity software in, say, Azure versus on-prem, and actually leverage, closer tenancy to your Microsoft environment, versus bringing it all down on-prem? There's this design considerations there. And same goes with the as a service piece. When it's data management as a service, it's do you want to manage it, or do you want us to manage it? If the customer wants us to manage all of it, then that's a perfect play for the as a service piece. Now we're the same as other as a service providers. We've got things that we will monitor and maintain as far as the infrastructure goes, but it really doesn't matter, I guess, if that makes sense, to us, how you consume it, which is part of this whole shift, that we made last year to software only, and then now the shift to as a service, and then all the other. We've always had the different versions, right? We've always had the cloud versions and even virtual editions. Like it's also VEs that you can run too.
So I have one question.
In 27 parts.
And it's maybe do it.
He's going to be on your toes.
Sorry, we've all again, we're dating ourselves because there's certain movie references that Jon and I will always use, and those are some of the classics.
I don't think half the people that watch this are going to get that reference. So for those of you watching, that is from the movie Back to School. So I have a statement that was part of something that I was reading, and I just want to kind of see your agreement, disagreement. Maybe you want to tweak that, but it said and I quote, "The Cohesity data platform was built with the public cloud in mind and provides an easy on-ramp to using elastic, on-demand public cloud services, and in this scenario, it was such as Microsoft Azure."
I haven't read that one yet. That's an interesting one. I do tend to agree with it, because from day one, cloud was always a big part of it. And what I mean by that is I worked at another storage company prior to here, and and cloud was an afterthought, meaning archival to things like S3 or Google or Azure was added into the product later, if that makes sense. When I came here, it was were we still on version 4, or was it just I think it had just flipped to 5 when I got here. And from day one at my role here, it was always integrated into cloud solutions, whether it was we were backing up, stuff within the cloud, or we were using cloud resources for other reasons, whether it was cloud tier or the archival pieces. So it's all on how you interpret the statement, I guess, that it was, built for cloud. I'd say it was built to integrate and work well with cloud. And then as we've sort of proven with our as a service model, it can run as a service provider, on top of AWS, for instance, is the way we're doing it.
Yeah. And I'll add to that when you think about what some of the legacy backup vendors of choice that we used back in the 90s and the early 2000s, when cloud came around, there was always a bolt-on solution. There was no real way to use it natively within the architecture in question. It was always kind of this foreign feeling addition that you tried to add to the system. And all it was there for was to filter the traffic that went to and from the different cloud. I'm talking about basically like cloud gateways that used to exist for certain backup products that were out there. In our particular case, we're talking directly with the APIs of the public APIs of those particular solutions that are out there. And we will continue to always prefer the APIs versus having to flow through another hardware solution to make that happen. So as we grow the portfolio, also does the guessing game of essentially keeping up with everybody's new API changes as they come out. But it is I won't call it a problem, but it is something that we've chosen to take on and to continue to do and ensure that we innovate as they innovate and add more things to it. An example would be like AWS S3 buckets and all the different types now that you can work with. We have integration now to work with that instead of just a straight, you have to use S3 regular instead of S3 IA or an AZ version of it, and depending upon what meets your particular needs. So trying to keep up with all these other components, you pretty much have to play this game to continue to get what the customers are wanting. And what the customers don't want is another bolt-on foreign feeling solution that basically just, you don't know, it's a whole nother layer of complexity just for that particular piece instead of being built into the product.
Now, I think that's a great point. And more customers are looking for that, single point, solution to manage some of those various workloads. One thing that I'm a big fan of is starting to see backup and disaster recovery start to come into the same solution. Excited to see what you guys are doing there. Can you guys talk a little bit about things like CDP and things like bridging the gap between you might have one workload that once a day backups is fine, but other applications where you might have a more stringent RPO.
Yeah, Chris, I'll let you. Let you take this one.
Yeah, I've been dealing with CDP for a while now. It always is going to come back to your point, Kirk. Which applications need which level of service, right? And I actually did with this video that I posted on CDP that actually does highlight that specific example where you've got workloads that you can't have hourly, right? And actually, this goes back to the recovery conversation, which is, okay, when the event happens, how far back do I have to go, and what's my gap? And we've always known about RTOs and RPOs, but we didn't really pay attention to them before. I mean, we did, but it was like yesterday was typically the recovery time objective was, well, if I can get it back to 24 hours, I'm good. I think that gap has shrunk now, because you're dealing with more rapid transactions. You're dealing with things that, hey, if I have to go back 24 hours, that's a problem. Now, might not be a problem for every system, but it could be a problem for a certain subset of systems. So to your point, we've started integrating things like continuous data protection into the product so that you could say, hey, I've got this group of VMs that I want to go back to literally the second before the event happened, and I want to recover that instance, and we can still do that instantly. So it's not like we have to take that original snapshot that happened at the beginning of that CDP run. We still are maintaining that whole catalog. It's kind of fascinating when you look under the covers of how we can say, hey, it's not just the 12 o'clock snapshot, but it's the 1 minute before the event or the 30 seconds before the event. I could still grab that snapshot and recover it instantly. That is really impressive to customers when it comes to true disaster recovery, because there's also this whole conversation of what's the difference between BC and DR, right? And that still confuses people. One is not the same as the other, right? It's just because it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it might not be. But there's still that concept, right? There's still people who need business continuity, and those are different solutions. That's when you're looking at, solutions like an ESX Metro cluster, or things that are stretch clusters where you're actually operating, real time with your physical infrastructure stretched across to a campus or something else. We're not in that space, right? We're in the, even if all of that blows up or goes down, we can still bring back the recovery data very, very quickly, down to a second or down to a minute, depending on what you've configured. That's stretched into the site continuity piece that we announced a couple of months ago, which I'm still working to get my hands on. Well, I have it. I just have not. Literally, it's a time and materials problem right now. Give enough time and money, I can make anything happen. We're getting to the point where we're actually publishing a video on it from our team, but now there's that whole workflow piece where we take the CDP infrastructure, where you're taking constant continuous data protection, and then you're also replicating it to another cluster, right, at the same time. And now you can build a workflow that says, okay, I want to recover the data, but I don't want to recover it here. I want to recover it in that environment on the other side, right? So this whole concept of bringing it all into one place really is coming true for us, because we're trying to add the workflow pieces, the failover piece, all of that other stuff to what we're doing with the data under the covers.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. So, I think for me, I feel like this is been a great overview for me. I know that I've learned quite a few things from you guys today. So in that situation, let me ask for a 2 or 3 minute close from each of you, and I will let you guys do rock, paper, scissors to who goes first.
Oh, John can go first.
Of course. Well, so throughout this particular conversation, we've noted that, backup and recovery, the game is changing. The world is changing. The world has changed based off of needs of what organizations have, and being versatile and being malleable to be able to withstand what the world throws at you is of much more importance than just a concrete stability at that particular point. You need flexibility moving forward in how you approach the data within your organization. So hopefully during this particular conversation, you found that there's multiple different avenues to approach the concept of data management. And I hope that eventually something in here sparks an interest just even in the topic. I'm not even going to say specifically into Cohesity, but in upshifting that particular idea of what you're doing within your data center to something that's probably more aligned with the business at that particular point than the zeros and ones that are happening within the data center itself. There is an intersection point, and I think we're both parties are converging closer to it than ever before. And I think you're starting to see that with overlapping with technology and business ideals. And I think data management now is where we're going to start seeing that gray area combination between the two. And hopefully throughout this conversation, you've been able to learn quite a bit about what we bring to the table on both the technical side and the why behind why we're doing what we're doing.
I have like one quick statement, and I'll throw it to you, Chris. I think out of everything, I think it's important to kind of highlight that backup and recovery at this point is no longer just a base technical function. It becomes a part of the business process. And all of the requirements need to be taken into account. It's no longer just like, how quickly can I do this? It's what can the business truly sustain in that scenario? And that's kind of what I'm taking out of this.
Yeah, and my close is really more around it's about the partnerships we have with folks like yourselves, right? Because we can only cover so much ground. Folks like you are actually building the solutions, and we want to be a part of the solution you're building. So the more that even your internal teams really understand what we're trying to do and can position a Cohesity platform where it really does fit and based on those customer needs, I think that's a huge part for us, right? I mean, these relationships we're building with the partner community is one of the biggest things that John and I try to do as well. I would agree that it's not always about backup and recovery with Cohesity. It still always seems to start there, and it sort of seems to end there sometimes during the conversations. But it's hard not to. It really is hard not to, because what I always leave people with, in the last statement I always tell people, and I usually have this one slide that I show everybody, that if you don't remember anything about Cohesity, remember this one picture. And the picture is basically how we provide access to the data immediately in our recovery scenario, where in other solutions you're not getting access to the systems until the end of the process. So think of it as like a mirror image, right? We've 180'd the whole thing. And that's what I want people, when we're talking recovery, that's all I want people to remember is, look at Cohesity if your need to access the systems has to be immediate versus at the end of the entire process. And if that's all you remember, great, let's go evaluate the product and see how it actually works for yourself in your own environment.
All right, I've just forgotten everything else that you have said, and I'm only going to remember the one thing. I'm just kidding. No, but again, I really appreciate you guys taking the time. I know that for me, I've at least picked up quite a few things that I didn't potentially know, and hopefully, Ron, Kirk, you guys definitely enjoyed the conversation, and looking forward to continuing to working with you guys. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, anything we can do. We John and I actually enjoy talking to the partners and the partner architects, especially too, from a field CTO level, because I think, again, it's getting them to understand the stuff that we've talked about and ask questions and say, well, where do I position it? Why would I position you over somebody else? And without getting into the bits and bytes, right? There's business level reasons why we think we fit better, and definitely we can do those going forward with you guys as well.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. That was a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the time.
Thanks for joining us today. Yep.